So imagine that you face a daunting challenge, addressing malnutrition and nutrient deficiencies that affect people all around the world. People who live in different countries, they have different diets, different nutrient challenges. How would you devise a way to affect the health and well-being of millions of people and do so in a way that could be permanent and sustainable? Today's guest has done just that. I'm Kelly Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University and Professor of Public Policy at Duke. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food. Dr. Howarth Bouis is Director of Harvest Plus, a highly innovative program within the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. He founded the program in 2003 as a global effort to improve nutrition and health through crop biofortification. He is an agriculture economics expert with bachelor's and PhD degrees from Stanford, and for his pioneering work in this area was awarded the highly revered World Food Prize in 2016. So, Dr. Bouis, by any standard, you're a public health, agriculture, and food policy hero for your work on biofortification. And before asking you to describe what this is, I'd hope you could explain what nutrition needs and problems you saw on the world stage that led you to form Harvest Plus in the first place.
Sure, Kelly. Thanks for having me. I think it really started I joined where I'm still working today, IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, in 1982. And I was in the Food Consumption and Nutrition Division, and we're economists, and our division was studying how to improve nutrition and health in developing countries. And back then, the barometer, what was our barometer of better nutrition? It was calories, more energy. People were hungry, and it was generally regarded that the poor people, needed to eat more food staples to get more energy in their diet. So I was collecting household survey data, and my research didn't show that. It was kind of a difficult time for me. I found that the poorer and the little bit richer ate about the same amount of food staples, but what was really correlated with better nutrition was their dietary quality, their consumption of vegetables and fruits and animal and fish products. I felt we were using, in economics, we were using the wrong barometer. So I was attending nutrition conferences at the time, and the nutritionists had new findings that showed that vitamin A supplements given to preschool children, one pill every 6 months, could reduce childhood mortality by 23%. And it was a surprisingly large number to the nutrition community. And they started looking at other minerals and vitamins. They found that children who were iron deficient when they were young impaired their cognitive abilities. And it was an impairment that couldn't be reversed later on through, say, iron supplementation. It was estimated that about 2 billion women and children in developing countries were subject to iron deficiency. And it's kind of the same story for zinc deficiency. About 2 billion women and children are subject to those deficiencies. And it's estimated that about 450,000 preschool children die because of zinc deficiency each year. Their immune systems are compromised because of the zinc deficiency. So there's this huge public health problem out there in terms of people not getting dietary quality, not getting enough minerals and vitamins in their diets, with all these terrible consequences for their health.
So those are very impressive but sad numbers. So tell us about the concept of biofortification and why you believe this was a good way to proceed as opposed to other ways one might go about addressing these
Yeah.
world food issues.
So I'm an economist by training. So I'm always looking what's the most efficient way to treat a problem. And even though the supplementation, the food fortification programs are doing a lot of good, continue to do a lot of good, it wasn't addressing the underlying problem. You have recurrent costs year after year after year. So for example, in the last 20 years, 10 billion with a B, 10 billion vitamin A supplements have been given out because people aren't getting enough vitamin A in their diets. So I thought, well, what if we can get the plants to do the work? What if we can breed plants that take up more trace minerals from the soils and load those trace minerals into the seeds? What if we can get plants that synthesize more vitamin A in their seeds? That would be a much less costly and more efficient way of getting minerals and vitamins in the diet. It would be much more sustainable. So that's essentially what biofortification is. You can use modern plant breeding techniques. Harvest Plus uses conventional breeding techniques. We don't use GMOs. We cross high mineral or vitamin dense varieties with high yielding varieties, and we get high yielding varieties that have more minerals and vitamins in them. So let's take an example of maize in Africa. The most widely consumed staple food in Africa is maize. Most of the maize is white. White maize has no vitamin A in it. Maybe 40% of preschool children in Africa suffer from vitamin A deficiency. So we now have high yielding orange mazes, which are very high in vitamin A. They can provide an extra 40% of vitamin A requirements in diets any day that you substitute the orange maize for the white maize in your diet. So it's very simple. Consume the orange maize for the same price and protect your family from vitamin A deficiency. So what did the mothers say? They say, how does it taste? And so we do the blind taste tests, and sure enough, they can taste a difference. But it's a little bit sweeter, and they actually like the taste of the orange maize. So once they know that they like the taste, we can get people to switch to the orange maize. So my vision is 20 years from now, all of the mazes or most of the mazes in Africa will be orange maize. And a grandchild will ask her grandmother, I heard maize used to be white. Was that true? The grandmother will say, yes, when I was a child, we used to eat white maize. And people don't know it, but carrots used to be white. Now everybody expects carrots to be orange. In a nutshell, that's what biofortification is all about.
Boy, you can just imagine the reach and impact of an approach like this. So before we get into talking about more specific examples of how crops have been modified, you mentioned specifically that you don't use GMOs as an approach. Why is that?
Well, we don't consider GMOs dangerous at all, and actually, scientifically, it's a very powerful technology that we wish we could use. But there are political constraints. And when we got started, we were afraid if we invested in GMOs, the political constraints would keep the varieties on the shelves. We'd never be able to get out to farmers. We've invested all of our funds in conventional crop breeding. And we've now released varieties. We've passed the tests of varietal release committees in more than 30 countries around the world, and within 4 or 5 years, will be released in 60 countries around the world. And that number might be zero if we'd use GMO technologies.
Oh, it's so interesting that it's a political issue like that. So you focused on foods like rice, wheat. You mentioned maize, but also cassava, beans, and sweet potatoes. Why are these the foods? Now, I imagine they're important because these are parts of the staple diets, but are they also particularly flexible in terms of breeding to get the correct nutrients? Why these in particular?
Yes, it is a combination of factors. How widely is the staple food crop consumed? So the most widely consumed staple in developing countries is rice, and that's followed by wheat, and that's followed by maize, and then cassava. Those four are the big four in terms of the numbers of people that you can reach. Then there's just other considerations that come up. So, for example, beans. When we were broaching the idea with scientists, the breeder at our bean center in our system got really interested in the idea, and he really wanted to make his beans high in iron. And so by the time we got, the funding that we needed to really implement the program, he'd already made a lot of progress. And so it was very easy for us to incorporate bean. By the same token, the orange sweet potatoes are already available in the United States. We eat orange sweet potatoes in the United States. Africans eat white sweet potatoes. So it was more a matter of adapting the agronomic properties of the orange sweet potatoes here in the United States, doing the plant breeding to adapt them to growing conditions in Africa. And so it was actually the orange sweet potatoes that were the first biofortified crops released, the first crops available.
Oh, is there anything lost potentially in this breeding process? For example, if you could take a food and breed it so that it has more vitamin A, will it have less of something else? Is there any downside that has to be taken into account?
Well, the first when I first the first thing I had to do was talk to the scientists. So I had this kind of what seemed like a nice idea from an economics point of view back in 1993, but I had to talk to the plant breeders and see if they thought it was scientifically feasible. And they actually told me they thought it was a bad idea. Most of them said that there'd be a trade-off in yield. You'd breed in more nutrient content into the seed, but you'd get a lower yield. And I knew farmers were not ever going to adopt a lower yielding crop. So there was they felt there was almost a genetic linkage between high nutrient content and low yield. But I found a small group of scientists that told me no, actually, if you put more zinc in a seed, the seeds need the zinc. It's for the plant nutrition. The seed, when it's planted, it's a high zinc seed is more vigorous. It gets a better start, and it's actually going to be higher yielding. I said, what? You mean it's not a win-lose? It's a win-win. And they said, yes, absolutely. So the long and the short of it is that no, you can make a lot of progress with breeding. You can maintain the properties that are already there, and then you can add the additional amounts of the minerals and vitamins that go along with the same good agronomic properties that are already in the seeds.
Well, I know you've done some particularly interesting work with beans and the use of biofortification. Can you explain how that's worked and what the effects have been?
Yes. So the first thing that we needed to do, and with each of the crops, but I'm going to talk about our iron beans and our experience in Rwanda. The first thing that we had to do was an efficacy trial. So we've done the plant breeding at the central location. Our plant breeder with beans that was so interested in iron early on. And we gave a group of college-age women in Rwanda, we fed them with the high iron beans, and then we had another group that was randomly selected that ate the regular beans that didn't have as much iron as the high iron beans. And we found that the iron status of the women who ate the high iron beans, their iron status improved. But more importantly, we found that the women who ate the high iron bean improved their cognitive performance. Better iron status is associated with better ability to perform work. You don't get as tired as easily. So we showed these improved functional outcomes in our controlled efficacy trials. So that's something that we've done with each one of the crops in the various countries where we're introducing them. So that was the first step. Then the lines. So we might have 50 promising lines that grow well at our central location where we're doing the research. So we bring those 50 lines to Rwanda and we make them available to the Rwandan Agricultural Board, which does the agricultural research in Rwanda. So they take those lines and they do multi-location testing around Rwanda. They see that some of the lines do well in the Rwandan context, other lines don't do well. They pick the best lines. They do some of their own crossing with the varieties that are doing well in Rwanda, and it takes a few years, and they get these high yielding lines that are high in iron, and then they have to be tested by the varietal release committee over a 2-year period. They're certified as high yielding, and they can be released to farmers. So you can imagine that this process, takes place over a period of about 10 years. Then in 2011, we actually released 10 varieties. 10 have been approved for release. You want several varieties because different farmers like different aspects of the way beans grow. You have climber beans, you have bush beans, and we had funding to through various means to multiply the bean seed and make them available to farmers all around Rwanda. And so we did then in 2015, we did a nationwide survey and we found that 30% of farmers in Rwanda had tried growing the high iron beans. We accounted for roughly about 10% of bean production. But the most important finding from that survey was that our high iron beans were 20% higher yielding. And it isn't because they were biofortified, it's because they were the best agronomic varieties that were available from our main agricultural research center. Then those agronomically superior lines, so for example, they're heat tolerant, as you know, beans like cold temperatures to grow in, and so these are heat tolerant beans. They're just the best agronomic varieties that are available from our agricultural research system, and we aggressively marketed these new bean lines to farmers. Now we've continued our monitoring surveys, and we now account for 20% of bean production in Rwanda. So we've had impacts in terms of improving the productivity of bean production. The incomes of the Rwandan bean farmers have gone up, and of course they're eating the high iron beans, so they're improving their health because they're getting more iron in their diets.
Well, what an impressive story. And it's nice to know that the percentage of beans being produced this way is growing and growing. So, if you look ahead, are there some especially promising forms of biofortification that are on the horizon now, and where do you expect this field will go?
Well, our big focus and objective now is reaching a billion people and eventually more than a billion people. I've described how we'll have the varieties released in 60 countries. We have a lot of breadth, but our big challenge now is to get the kind of depth that we've achieved in Rwanda in other countries as well. So we're working with a number of different types of organizations to mainstream the use of biofortification in their everyday activities. So, for example, there's a very prominent nutrition organization called the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition that originally worked a lot on food fortification, commercial food fortification, and they still work on that, but they've gotten more heavily now into improving dietary quality. And we formed a partnership with them now, and we're working together to scale up biofortified crops in South Asia and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, and also in Africa, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, and in Kenya. So by reaching into the nutrition community and mainstreaming with the nutrition community, we're really able to grow the amount of funding and the amount of activities that we're able to work on in terms of scaling up the adoption and the consumption of the biofortified crops. That's just one example. We're working with the World Food Program in various countries around the world, for example, in their school feeding programs, introducing biofortified crops in those programs. International financial institutions, the World Bank, and their loans to African countries now is including funding for the scale up of biofortified crops. Private seed companies are starting to develop their own varieties of biofortified crops. About 70% of maize production in Africa is hybrid seed. So the hybrid seed companies now have their own orange varieties. And the constraint is just building up the demand among the consumers, and we'll have all the maize seed that we need. And then our centers themselves, I've mentioned the bean example, our public agricultural research centers. We're in the process now of converting all of the lines that they're releasing, that they're sharing with the National Agricultural Research System. They're converting everything into biofortified varieties. So that's the future for us, is just working towards the most staple foods produced in developing countries in the next, after the next 20 years, most of them will be biofortified.
Why, this work is so important and so impressive, and it's not surprising but wonderful that you were awarded the World Food Prize for this. So, thank you so much for joining us, for being a leading voice in food, and please know how much I appreciate you doing this podcast today. Thanks again.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, Kelly. Thank you very much.
Our guest has been Dr. Howarth Bouis, founder and director of the Harvest Plus program. And thank you for listening. If you would like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food series, you may do so at Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, or Apple Podcast, or by visiting the website at the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.